Bending toward mercy. It's the Sabbath day. Jesus is heading to church. He has spent the day being challenged. Try to eat with those who the world wanted left behind. He had sat down with the tax collectors and the sinners and everyone who didn't like that he thought they were beloved, that they were created in the image of God, that they belonged in the dawning kingdom. Challenged what he did. It's been a day of challenge. So after eating with them, some others come up to him, some other religious folk, and they want to know why on this holiday, at this point in time, he is not fasting like the rest of them. Why have they not stopped eating? Why aren't they? Why aren't they following the rules? Bending toward mercy. Jesus is bending toward mercy in each of these encounters where everyone challenged every move he makes. He's bending toward mercy as they challenge how we're supposed to live our lives. So here's the thing about this challenge. In Jesus' day, people were trying to figure out how, under occupation, how under Roman rule, you could retain who you were. How you could be the people that you were without conforming to the Roman rulers. How could you retain your identity? How could you be your own people? And so during that time, the group that the Gospels call the Pharisees and Scribes were trying to renew the people. We're trying to bring them back into some sort of order, to bring back the traditions that had held them together through wave upon wave of occupation, through wave upon wave of people taking over their kingdom, their land, and telling them how to live. During those waves, different groups of religious folk would rise up to say, this is what it means to be our people. And during Jesus' time, the Pharisees were that group of people that were rising up. They were trying to establish what it would be like to be a people of God in the midst of occupation. But what Jesus saw, what Jesus wanted is a different way of being. That the rules, the traditions, were harming some of those who were least able to follow the rules and traditions. He wanted the world to bend toward mercy, to bend toward compassion. And so our story of the challenges begins today with a challenge over Sabbath. With a challenge asking the questions about what does it mean to practice Sabbath? How do you live out a Sabbath practice in a world that doesn't want you to live it? So, they question him. They question him about not being religious enough, not doing the things that you should do, because on the Sabbath, you were supposed to give up all work. You were supposed to rest with your family, with God. You were supposed to give up the worldly things and be present with the holy. And Jesus and his disciples were from one of the lowest class. They didn't have a lot of wealth or money. And because they didn't have a lot, when you ask people to give up work on the Sabbath, you're telling those who are poor that they have to starve. that they have to go hungry, that they aren't allowed to get food because the food they get is often from gleaning. Meaning, when you're poor, the idea was that there would be a portion of the field set aside that the poor could come and take the harvest from. And so Jesus and his disciples are walking through a grain field. And they pluck the heads. And plucking is considered work. But when you're hungry, is it work to get the thing that will sustain you? The food that will give you life? Is it work when you're in need of that food? And that's part of the question today. How do we bend the rules towards compassion and mercy? How do we honor God and the Sabbath? How do we follow the traditions of our people, but also make sure that we're not excluding someone from the kingdom? And so, as they are traveling through those fields, gleaning the harvest, the Pharisees, the religious leaders, those who are trying to pull the people of God together, question Jesus' way of practicing faith. They question what the Sabbath is for, who the Sabbath is for. How do you live during the Sabbath? And Jesus tells them the story about David. That when David was fleeing for his life, surrounded by enemies, the Philistines on one side, King Solomon's forces on another, he took refuge in a church. And the only thing to eat there in the church was the bread of the presence. Meaning, the bread that had been donated to give to God, to feed the priests, was the only thing there. And David ate that bread and shared it with his men. And Jesus asked those who are challenging him, what is the Sabbath for? What is the Sabbath for? Is it to let the hungry be hungry? Is to let those who have a need suffer? What's the Sabbath for? And who's in charge of what the Sabbath is about? I mean, he argues that God's in charge of the Sabbath. How would God look at the world? How would God look at the Sabbath day? Now, I find it an interesting question because in our world, we don't practice Sabbath day rituals anymore. Now, I shouldn't say that. All of you are here for an hour, but is an hour a Sabbath day? What does the rest of the day look like? How do you experience the Sabbath? How do you bend it towards mercy? And in a world that says, you don't have a choice, you have to work today, what sacrifices do you have to make to practice the Sabbath? And how is the church in a world that says everything is wide open, your boss can get you by text message and email all day long, that you have to work today because that shift is the only one available to you? How do you practice the Sabbath? Because many of you can remember the days not too long ago, because even in my lifetime, when the Sabbath was set aside, at least our Sabbath, a Christian Sabbath. Because when I moved to Connecticut when I was 22, I was shocked, tell you shocked, because you couldn't buy alcohol a college student, okay? So everybody in my class had to run to Massachusetts for a beer run on Sundays because everything was shuttered on Sundays in Connecticut. They had what was used to be blue laws, meaning everything had been closed, like there was no business except for emergency services. By the time I got there, they now only had limited blue laws. So there were certain things that you couldn't do on the Sabbath day. But how many of you remember those days when the world shut down on Sunday? The stores weren't open, the offices were closed. The only phone calls you got were family and friends. You practice Sabbath. So we don't live in that world anymore. How do we practice Sabbath now in a way that bends it towards mercy? How do we practice Sabbath in a world that won't let you unplug? How do we practice Sabbath as a church to open wide the doors so that those who have to work at 10 o'clock on Sunday morning can experience the presence of God? How do you practice Sabbath when the world won't let you? It's a good question for us as churches to think about. Because it's nice to want to set the day aside. And I totally think that you should take a day where you unplug and don't look at TikTok or Twitter or Facebook, where you don't read the news so that you can center yourself and calm and let that busyness of the world go. But I also think that maybe part of our role as the church is to talk about how we've structured work so badly now that people don't have time to rest. That we have structured work so that people don't have a living wage and have to work too many jobs, so that they don't have the ability to have a day given to God. How do we as the church advocate for different policies? Because you know how the Scandinavian countries are really good about certain things. And one of the things that some of them are trying is changing work hours. Reducing work hours and school hours to a different way of being so that people don't have to work 70 hours a week or 60 hours a week or even 40 hours a week. Some of them are moving to 30-hour weeks. That would mean that you have time to play and create and dream. But they don't cut your pay so that you can't survive. They allow you to have enough so that your world can be enriched on those days off. Maybe part of our job as the church is to teach that rest is good, that the world needs to provide times of rest. And maybe we need to teach the world that we need to bend toward mercy. Because the final part of this challenge section of Jesus has Jesus heading into church, and as soon as he sees the man in front of him, he knows that they've set him up. That they want him to fail, that they want him to do what the law says you were supposed to do. And the law says that you don't do work on the Sabbath, that you rest, that you don't heal on the Sabbath day. And Jesus sees the man. But if you read the scripture text at this point, he's not looking at the man. He's not interacting with the man. He's looking at those who are challenging him. His eye is on them when he asks, what is the Sabbath for? Is the Sabbath meant to be a day to do good? Is the Sabbath meant to be a day to save lives? And I know because we all agreed that we wanted the compassionate Jesus, but this is angry-eyed Jesus. It says Jesus got angry at those challengers. Jesus could see that their hearts were hardened. And so then he looks at the man. He looks at the man and he says, "Stretch out your hand." And the man's hand is able to move and is healed. And that other group of religious leaders conspire with also a group that Mark made up, the Herodians. So for Mark, the Herodians are this group of people who are occupiers who are Jewish and work with the occupying forces to keep the people down. They are a fringe group, a radical group, a group that the other people would not necessarily join forces with because they aren't out for the best interests of the entire people. They are out for their own best interests. But it says they conspired. Instead of bending towards mercy, instead of saving a life, instead of doing good, they conspired. They conspired to get rid of Jesus. So how will you bend towards mercy? How will you save a life? How will you speak out? How will you do the good that is placed in front of you? Feed those who are hungry. Help those who are in need. Honor the Sabbath. Take time to shut off your phone, to turn off the news, and to interact with your family. To take time to eat with your friends. How will you save a life and do good? How will you help Jesus help the world bend towards mercy? Amen.